From New York, this is Democracy Now!
We're in urgent need of getting a code of safety as soon as possible. We already have been doing a medevac of 6 critical patients. We need a code of safety as soon as possible.
Over 700 refugees were rescued in the Mediterranean this weekend as they attempted to reach Europe in what's been a deadly year for migrants fleeing poverty, violence and the climate crisis. We'll get the latest from one of the rescue organizations, and we'll look at a new book that reports the nation's top general, Mark Milley, feared Donald Trump would wage a coup after losing the November election.
Those days became so much more harrowing, of course, after the election when Milley saw parallels between Hitler and Trump and what Trump was saying, the misinformation he was spewing about election fraud. But he continued to try to be a bulwark, a safeguard in preventing what he thought could have been a coup by President Trump to stay in power.
And we'll get the latest from occupied East Jerusalem, where the Israeli Supreme Court has offered to allow Palestinian residents of Sheikh Jarrah to avoid being forcibly evicted from their homes, but only if they begin paying rent to a Jewish settlement organization. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Amy Goodman is off today. The United States has finally hit the Biden administration's goal of administering COVID-19 vaccines to 70% of U.S. adults, 1 month later than it had hoped. The milestone came as the U.S. reported more than 135,000 new cases, the highest number of daily infections since February. On Monday, Louisiana Governor John Bel Edwards reimposed a statewide mask mandate as his state set a record for new infections and hospitals became overwhelmed with COVID patients.
We're the worst in the country in terms of this COVID surge, and that is because of the Delta variant, which is a game changer, and the fact that, quite frankly, not enough people have been vaccinated here in Louisiana.
On Monday, county officials across the San Francisco Bay Area ordered new mask mandates indoors, even for vaccinated people, joining Los Angeles, which reimposed similar measures last month. Here in New York, Mayor Bill de Blasio urged unvaccinated people to wear masks indoors, but stopped short of ordering a new mandate. Meanwhile, Governor Andrew Cuomo said tens of thousands of New York transit workers must show proof of vaccination or face weekly testing. At the White House, Jeff Zients, the White House coronavirus response coordinator, said Monday similar rules will apply to some 4 million federal workers.
Any federal employee who does not attest or is not vaccinated will be required to mask no matter where they work, get tested once or twice a week, socially distance, and generally will not be allowed to travel for work.
The United States and the United Kingdom have accused the Afghan Taliban of massacring civilians as they captured a town in Kandahar province near the Pakistan border. The U.S. and U.K. embassies in Kabul both tweeted Monday that dozens of civilians were slaughtered in Spin Boldak in revenge killings that could constitute, quote, war crimes. The statements came as the U.S. stepped up airstrikes aimed at slowing a rapid advance by the Taliban in several Afghan provincial capitals. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Tony Blinken said Monday the U.S. would offer refugee status to Afghans who worked for U.S.-funded projects and NGOs in Afghanistan. The State Department said Operation Allies Refuge could resettle as many as 50,000 people. Immigrant justice groups are suing the Biden administration over its use of Title 42, a Trump-era policy that allows for the expedited deportations of asylum seekers arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border, citing so-called public health concerns during the pandemic. The Biden administration says it will continue enforcing the policy, which could bar entry to hundreds of thousands of asylum seekers. Human Rights Watch says over 600,000 asylum seekers have been expelled from the U.S. under Title 42 since March of 2020. The lawsuit was filed by the American Civil Liberties Union, Raíces, and Oxfam, among other groups, which denounced Title 42 as cruel, illegal, and a violation of due process rights. In Texas, the Inspector General for the Department of Health and Human Services is launching an investigation into allegations of unsafe conditions at Fort Bliss, a former military base reopened by the Biden administration to detain thousands of unaccompanied migrant children. The probe comes after 2 whistleblowers last week warned about the dire and filthy conditions at the tent camp, saying children are also facing inadequate mental and health care. In Washington, D.C., President Biden and Democratic leaders face backlash Monday from progressives who blasted them for allowing a federal moratorium on evictions to expire. At the White House, presidential advisor Gene Sperling said a June Supreme Court ruling prevented the Centers for Disease Control from taking steps to extend the moratorium without congressional action, despite the worsening pandemic.
To date, the CDC director and her team have been unable to find legal authority even for a more targeted eviction moratorium that would focus just on counties with higher rates of COVID spread.
Missouri Congresswoman Cori Bush, who's been camped out on the steps of the Capitol since Friday in protest, spoke briefly with Vice President Kamala Harris Monday and reportedly came away disappointed. Joining the protest Monday were New York Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Vermont Independent Senator Bernie Sanders, who tweeted, quote, "It's outrageous that in the middle of a deadly pandemic, the eviction moratorium has ended. We cannot allow people to be thrown onto the streets," unquote. Elsewhere in Washington, police arrested at least 204 people Monday as they held a nonviolent civil disobedience protest demanding that Senate Democrats end the filibuster and enact voting rights legislation. Among those arrested were Reverend William Barber of the National Poor People's Campaign, along with his co-director, Reverend Liz Theo-Harris, and the longtime civil rights leader, Reverend Jesse Jackson. Meanwhile, a new study shows Democrats could lose control of the House next year thanks to Republican gerrymandering in the states of Georgia, Florida, North Carolina, and Texas. An analysis by the data firm Target Smart shows Republicans could win as many as 13 House seats simply by redrawing congressional districts in their favor. Republicans need just 5 seats to regain control of the House. A 4th Washington, D.C. area police officer who responded to the violent January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol has died by suicide. D.C.'s Metropolitan Police Department says Officer Gunter Hashida was found dead in his home Thursday. Officers Howard Liebengood, Kyle DeFreitag, and Jeffrey Smith also took their own lives in the wake of the assault by a mob incited by then-President Trump. More than 100 officers were injured. A warning to our viewers, this headline contains graphic footage of police violence. In Florida, 5 Miami Beach police officers have been suspended from their jobs and criminally charged after they were filmed repeatedly kicking and body slamming a black man in handcuffs before brutally assaulting a bystander who filmed the incident. The bystander, 28-year-old Khalid Vaughn, had faced charges of impeding a police investigation and resisting arrest with violence, but those charges were dropped when video showed he posed no threat to the officers who assaulted him. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo was questioned for 11 hours by investigators from the State Attorney General's office looking into sexual harassment allegations against him. That's according to the New York Times, which reported the meeting took place in Cuomo's office last month. At least 10 women have accused Cuomo of sexual misconduct, prompting New York Attorney General Letitia James to launch a probe. Members of Cuomo's inner circle have also been interviewed by investigators. Israel's Supreme Court has deferred a ruling on the expulsion of 4 Palestinian families from their homes in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of occupied East Jerusalem. The court instead offered the families a deal. They could stay in their homes for now if they begin paying rent to a Jewish settlement organization which claims ownership over the disputed properties. The Palestinian families rejected the deal, insisting they were the legal owners. The United Nations has described the planned evictions as a possible war crime. Later in the broadcast, we'll go to East Jerusalem for the latest. In climate news, Chinese officials say over 300 people were killed during record-shattering floods that devastated Henan province last month. That's more than triple the number previously reported. Elsewhere, the eastern Mediterranean is enduring a record heat wave, with massive wildfires continuing to spread across Turkey. Greece's Prime Minister warned Monday of the potential for rolling blackouts, with some forecasters predicting Europe could soon surpass its all-time high temperature record of 48 degrees Celsius or 118 degrees Fahrenheit.
We are dealing with the worst heat wave since 1987. As you can imagine, the increased demand for electricity creates a significant burden on the system.
In Minnesota, the GNU Collective is reporting at least 20 water protectors were brutally arrested over the weekend, including Indigenous lawyer and activist Tara Hauska, as resistance to the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline continues. Water protectors say state and local police used tear gas, rubber-coated bullets and pepper bullets and denied medical care to those held in jail. Some were reportedly held in solitary confinement. Hauska on Monday published photos of herself with bruises on her arms and several wounds from police rubber bullets. To see our interviews with Tara Hauska about resistance to the Line 3 pipeline, go to democracynow.org. And in Switzerland, some 30 climate justice advocates were arrested Monday after peacefully blocking the entrances to two of the country's largest banks in Zurich's financial district. On Twitter, the group Collectif Break Free Suisse, which led the demonstration, said, quote, either phase out fossil fuels or faced forest fires, famines, droughts and floods. This is one of the protesters.
We are not here because we're stupid or have nothing else to do. We're here because we no longer know what we can do. We have fought for 2 years.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Nermeen Sheikh in New York. Amy Goodman is off today. And I'm joined by Democracy Now! Co-host Juan Gonzalez in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Hi, Juan. Over 700 refugees were rescued in the Mediterranean this weekend as they attempted to reach Europe. Most of the rescues occurred off the coast of Libya and Malta. Rescue ships are now looking for safe locations to disembark the asylum seekers, many of whom need urgent medical care. This is Anne Decker speaking from the Sea-Watch 3 ship.
Many of them are super exhausted, have fuel burns, are seasick, are dehydrated, and have quite a number of them has chronic diseases. We urgently need a port of safety. We have requested already several times a port of safety, but so far have not received any reply. We're in urgent need of getting a port of safety as soon as possible. We already have been doing a medevac of 6 critical patients. We need a port of safety as soon as possible.
Another rescue group, SOS Méditerranée, has over 550 refugees on board its ship after conducting 6 rescue operations this weekend. This comes as the number of refugees trying to reach European soil continues to grow due to worsening poverty, violence and the climate crisis. According to the United Nations, over 1,100 refugees have perished crossing the Mediterranean so far this year. We're joined now by Laurence Bondard, spokesperson and Operations Communications Officer for SOS Méditerranée, based in Paris, France. She's been on 4 rescue missions in the Mediterranean, most recently March, April of this year. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Laurence. If you could begin by talking about these rescue operations, what they entail, and why this particular crossing, Libya to Malta or Libya to Italy, is as dangerous as it is.
Thank you very much for hosting me. Yes, the central Mediterranean is the migration deadliest route in the world. And this is due to a terrible lack of search and rescue maritime assets in the area. There are very, very few search and rescue ships, mostly SAR-NGO ships, and several of them are being hindered from operating. So the people that are actually fleeing via the sea and that are on tremendously unseaworthy dinghies, most of the time without life jackets, without enough food or water, are in extreme danger, and they they cannot always be rescued. Sometimes there are just no maritime assets in the area to rescue them. In addition to that, even when we are, for example, present and we performed, as you were explaining, 6 rescues this weekend, we performed them without maritime coordination. This means that despite the fact that we would, as per maritime law, inform the rescue coordination centers at all steps of the rescues, we received no coordination, no instructions, and we had to perform the rescues on our own.
And Laurence, how have the European countries responded when your boats or other rescue boats attempt to dock in their countries? Are there any countries in particular that are more hostile than others?
First, this is not really the question. The question is, we did ask for places of safety, and place of safety met specific criteria. Place of safety is where basic needs are met for the people rescued at sea, meaning they can receive medical care, they will have food, water, and it's also where their life is no longer threatened. For example, we would never disembark people rescued at sea off the coast of Libya, in Libya, because it is not a place of safety, and this has been repeatedly said by UN and European institutions. So we have now indeed requested several times for a place of safety to the competent maritime authorities and to the most able to assist maritime authorities. And this is where now we are waiting answers. We have not yet been given positive answers. It is essential to understand that European solidarity here is crucial. Coastal states must be supported by a European solidarity, and the number of people crossing is not that huge compared to the number of people living in Europe, the population in Europe. So it's really just a question of political will.
And how has the COVID pandemic changed the rescue operations?
We've had to adapt, and since the outbreak of the pandemic, we've had implemented very strict COVID-19 protocols in order to guarantee the safety of our operations and the safety of the survivors on board and of our teams. So, for example, all of our teams are wearing specific personal protective equipment. They do that during rescues and on the deck of the ship. And when survivors arrive, they are explained the preventive measures to respect. They are given masks. There is a temperature check of all of them upon their arrival. And we're asking them, for example, also to wash their hands as much as they can. We are implementing very, very strict protocols on board.
And Laurence, could you explain, even as the EU, various countries in the EU have been cracking down on voluntary rescue missions, such as the ones that your organization runs, they continue to support the Libyan Coast Guard in monitoring these crossings, these water crossings. Can you talk about the significance of that support and what groups like yours are calling for? What are the conditions inside Libyan detention centers where the Libyan Coast Guard takes migrants?
Indeed, since 2018, Libya has been granted a search and rescue region, is responsible of search and rescue regions in international waters of their coasts, which means that, and this is supported by the EU, they have been provided with patrol vessels and trainings and fundings for them to be able to intercept people trying to flee Libya via the sea. And these past years, but specifically even these past months, we've seen a huge increase in the number of interceptions at sea by Libyan coast guards. And these Libyan coast guards then return the survivors at sea to Libya. And this is absolutely illegal. And these are forcibly returns, as Libya, as I was explaining before, is not a place of safety. And maritime law is very clear rescue operations only end when survivors at sea the people in distress at sea are disembarked in a place of safety. And then many reports do explain how people that have been intercepted at sea by Libyan coast guards and forcibly returned are returning to a cycle of violence, forcibly detained in detention centers. And we've heard, as well as we've read, we've also heard on board testimonies of survivors who have attempted to cross the Mediterranean several times before we could rescue them. And they were explaining to us how they were beaten in detention centers, how they were their family were called on the phone while they were beaten so that the family would send some money for them to be freed, how they would be risking their lives at all steps in the streets because everyone apparently is armed in Libya, or many people are armed, and you can be killed just going out. Many women explain they just do not go out, as little as possible, only to go and get food and come back, because they're really too afraid to be abducted or killed or to face sexual violence. I've heard this harrowing story of this woman who was explaining that she was in a detention center with her small few-month-old baby, and some guards had dug a hole and put the baby in it, who was crying, and started to put sand over the baby in the hole. And the baby was crying, the mother was crying, many women were around, and eventually they took back the baby and gave it back to the mother. This was more of a psychological threat. But this kind of events and this kind of physical violence and psychological violence are daily reported to us by the survivors on board. One thing that most of the survivors say, if not all of them, is that Libya is hell on earth, and that they would rather die at sea than to die in Libya. For them, even if it's taking a tremendous risk to go at sea and to potentially die at sea, it's still a hope to survive, whereas for them in Libya, they see no hope.
And Lawrence, I wanted to ask you, there have been over 1,100 refugees who have perished crossing through these dangerous sea routes just this year. Where are these refugees coming from? Are they largely from Libya or other North African countries? And why are they fleeing their homes?
So in the number you're giving here is the number of people that are known to have died in the Mediterranean. Maybe there are more that unfortunately perished without any witness. And most of them died actually in the central Mediterranean. Since the beginning of the year, 990 people died in specifically the central Mediterranean. Where they're coming from, or where the people we rescue are coming from, some of them, a minority, but some of them are fleeing from Libya directly, and most of them are indeed in a migration journey. Currently on board, we have a majority of Bangladeshi people and Malian and Egyptian one, but we have 22 nationalities on board coming from West Africa and sub-Saharan countries of Africa, Nigeria, Eritrea, many countries. We also have few people currently on board that are coming from Yemen, from Syria. Crises are plenty in the world, and people will try and flee. Then when they are what they call trapped in Libya, which is not always their will, some of them tell us that they were not originally willing to come to Libya, but just on the way were, for example, trying to go to Algeria and were abducted in their way. The taxi driver would not drive them to Algeria, but to Libya, and they would realize they're in Libya when they're in it. And then they explain that they had no way out. That's what I can say from what we see on board.
Thank you so much, Laurence Bondard, spokesperson and Operations Communications Officer for SOS Méditerranée, based in Paris, France. She's been on 4 rescue missions in the Mediterranean, most recently March, April of this year. Next, we'll go to occupied East Jerusalem, where the Israeli Supreme Court has offered to allow Palestinian residents of Sheikh Jarrah to avoid being forcibly evicted from their homes, but only if they begin paying rent to a Jewish settlement organization. We'll speak with one of the residents of Sheikh Jarrah who's rejected the offer.
The way our lives go, we're passing through a wall we don't really know. Some don't even show any interest in the globe, pretending of their lives. They don't see with their eyes. They don't hear the people cry. They don't care if they die. But little do they know that whilst they do their evil deeds, we are not alone. For the guided angel sees, and one day the people will rise, and victory shall reign through the skies, and we will have that peace of mind, for everything will truly be fine. One day the people will rise, goodbye. Not out of time, rise and shine. One day the people will rise, goodbye. Not out of time, rise and shine. Today, not tomorrow.
The Way Our Lives Go by Femi Kuti. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Nermeen Sheikh with Juan Gonzalez. We go now to occupied East Jerusalem and the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, where Palestinian families are trying to block Jewish settlers from forcibly expelling them from their own homes. On Monday, the Israeli Supreme Court offered a deal to 4 of the Palestinian families facing eviction. They could stay in their homes for now if they begin paying rent to a Jewish settlement organization which claims ownership over the disputed properties. The Palestinian families rejected the deal, insisting they were the legal owners. The Israeli Supreme Court has not yet set a date for its final ruling. The United Nations has described the planned evictions as a possible war crime. UN Rights Office spokesperson Rupert Colville said in May, quote, "The occupying power cannot confiscate private property in occupied territories." Well, we're joined now by Mohammed El-Kurd, a Palestinian writer and poet who's organizing to save his family's home in Sheikh Jarrah. He was in the courtroom on Monday. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Mohammed. Could you describe what happened Monday in the court, what the proceedings were like, and what the response to the deal has been?
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. The court hearing at the Israeli Colonial Supreme Court was like any other hearing we've had, except for the massive amount of press outside the court hall. Essentially what happened is that we were in a courtroom that was speaking only in Hebrew, and we do not speak Hebrew. Most of us that live in Sheikh Jarrah do not speak Hebrew, so we were there playing a game of broken telephone, trying to decipher what is being said. But we understood that the Supreme Court is evading its responsibilities. The court is really aware of the international media pressure. They even explicitly made a remark about the media pressure. And so they wanted to reach a quote-unquote diplomatic solution. And so they're evading their responsibilities, pressuring us to reach a settlement with the settlers instead. Now, the way this is being reported or the way this is being conveyed might sound like a good deal, but what's happening here is that we would be living at the mercy of settlers, paying rent to live in our own homes, and dealing with all kinds of arbitrary policies. I imagine I personally don't love the idea of having a landlord, let alone having a settler landlord.
And Mohammed, could you go a little bit for our listeners and viewers who don't know the story of the history of your home going back to 1956? And you wrote in an article in The Nation last summer that your grandmother, who was an icon of Palestinian resistance, was one of the original people who settled in that particular home?
Yeah, absolutely. My grandmother was among 27 other families that were forcibly expelled from their homes in the 1948 Nakba upon the establishment of what is called the State of Israel on Palestinian lands through ethnic cleansing. And so they were made refugees, and they went from city to city, and they found themselves in Jerusalem. The United Nations, alongside the Jordanian government, decided to build Sheikh Jarrah, the units of Sheikh Jarrah, as a refugee project to house them. Unfortunately, they never, both of these entities never fulfilled their promises of transferring the land ownership to the Palestinian refugees because of the Naksa in 1967, because of the war with the Israeli forces. And so in the 70s, you began seeing Israeli settler organizations largely registered in the United States and funded by private donors in the United States claiming our property. Now, to understand this, you have to understand the larger picture that almost every neighborhood in occupied Jerusalem is facing the same threat of NGOs, settler NGOs that are fabricating documents and using an inherently biased judicial system, an inherently colonial judicial system to expel Palestinians. So you have a partnership here between the settler organizations and the state to expel Palestinians from Sheikh Jarrah. And this is exactly what's happened in Sheikh Jarrah since 1972. This has been 49 years of postponement and delays and court cases. So I think it's really important for people that are listening to understand that the punishment is not just in the act of the expulsion. The punishment is the process itself. It's losing your youth, losing your hope, losing the prospects of your future to the lingering threat of homelessness at all times. And this reality is not just for people in Sheikh Jarrah, it's a reality for hundreds of thousands of Palestinians all across Palestine.
And in terms of what is your hope in terms of the still to be the ruling to come from the Israeli court?
I would like to see the court make a ruling. I dare the court to make a ruling. You know, I know that these judges, these so-called justices, have been evading their responsibility of making a ruling because they have a reputation in the legal world. They have universities to go and give talks to Yale and Harvard, and they have places where they have to hold their head up high. But I would like them to make a ruling. Not that I ever expect that any ruling that would come from an Israeli court be in my favor or in the favor of Palestinians, because as we know, it is fundamentally colonial and biased against Palestinians. But I would like them to take their own actions. I am not going to settle. I am not going to compromise. I am not going to pay for my own dispossession. I would like them to confront the potential international ramifications for their actions.
And Mohammed, could you say a little bit more about the judges on this case? You pointed out in one of your tweets that Noam Solberg, one of the judges, himself lives in a settlement in the occupied West Bank.
Yeah, I mean, he's also not the only one of the Supreme Court justices that live in internationally recognized occupied territories. This is a system that does not care about international law, that does not care about the way it looks. You know, this is the High Court of Justice. It's in the name. This is the High Court of Justice, and it is erected on the rubble of land stolen from Palestinians. This system, this entire system, can never be in favor of Palestinians, nor can it ever be able to deliver justice to Palestinians here in Jerusalem.
And could you explain, Mohammed, the ongoing repression in Sheikh Jarrah as we speak, and the role of these settler organizations, in particular Nahalat Shimon, involved in this case?
Absolutely. You know, Amy had me on here a month or two ago, and I was talking about a blockade, an illegal blockade, where Israeli occupation forces blockaded our neighborhood and suppressed our children and tear gassed us and beat us with batons and threw skunk water at our homes. And this is very much still the reality. Just yesterday, we had to deal with a lot of Israeli occupation forces repressions in Sheikh Jarrah. What's really interesting, and it's not just an anomaly in Sheikh Jarrah, is the clear and explicit and unabashed partnership that takes place between the police forces, the soldiers, and the settlers, where they combine their efforts and collude to repress Palestinians. We've seen this in the West Bank, where Israeli settlers and soldiers work together to kill Palestinians. And we saw The Intercept even do a report on it. And we're seeing this every single day in Sheikh Jarrah, where settlers can just point at which Palestinians they'd like to see repressed or brutalized by the Israeli police officers, and exactly do the same. I mean, I will tell you, I had a journalist come into the neighborhood a few months ago, and I was telling her all kinds of things about this being a partnership and this being apartheid and the treatment that settlers get. And she didn't believe me until a settler pointed at her, and then boom, she was asked to leave the neighborhood, forced to leave the neighborhood, actually. And then she believed me. So it's really important to point out that when we say the system is made up of settlers, this manifests materially. This is a system built by settlers to expel Palestinians, and in every avenue it takes place, it's doing just that, serving settler supremacy, working to expel Palestinians.
And Mohammed, you tweeted that while you were in the courtroom, Israeli soldiers stormed into homes in the neighborhood?
Yes, while we were in the courtroom, the majority of the neighborhood actually went to the Supreme Court to support our families. And because we do this as a community, we do this as a neighborhood. And while we were outside, the Israeli forces raided 3 of our neighbors' homes. One of the homes actually is my friend's, Murad Atiyah's. His aunt is disabled and she's elderly, and they did not care to wake her from her sleep. They did not care to disrupt her, to horrify her in her bedroom with, saying that there are rioters hiding. I'm wondering where the rioters could be.
And Mohammed, the Times of Israel reported that the Israeli government was in fact hoping to postpone this hearing in a bid to assuage the Biden administration, which has opposed the evictions. So your response to that, and also the fact that Israel's new Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, is expected to arrive in the U.S. later this month for his first state visit and meeting with President Biden. What do you expect to happen during that meeting?
I mean, it's really clear that Sheikh Jarrah and the battle against Israeli ethnic cleansing has won in terms of the international media landscape. We have won. The fact that there were over 100 journalists awaiting our return from the courtroom yesterday exemplifies that we have won. And so the Israeli government is terrified of taking action against the community here in Sheikh Jarrah. I say this, however, knowing that this is a regime that have behaved for decades and decades, for 7 decades, with such impunity, has massacred and murdered and stolen lands and annexed illegally for decades and decades, and did so with such impunity that I worry that international outrage or diplomatic concerns might not deter it from doing this. I, like everybody else, I watch this from my couch and I wait to see what happens. But I will say that the general sentiment in Sheikh Jarrah, alongside the anxiety and sleeplessness, is the fury that our fate, our destiny is in the hands of colonizers, is at the mercy of laws that were made by colonizers to serve colonizers.
And Mohammed, very quickly before we conclude, you've said, and you've said again now, that you have no faith in the judicial process, but what you do have faith in is the kinds of protests that have happened all across the world. As you just said, that Sheikh Jarrah has already won. Could you talk about what you'd like to see happen on the streets from people across the EU and especially here in the U.S., the countries that have previously given unconditional support to the Israeli state?
I would like to see politicians and policymakers be loyal to the wishes of their constituents, to the people who live in their countries. It's very clear that the people of the world, the tide is turning, the dam has already cracked, and people are in support of Palestinian liberation and decolonization. And it's just about time that this support manifests materially, that boycotts, divestments, and sanctions be implemented, that people take on to the streets and continue taking on to the streets, because this cannot sustain. This system of apartheid, of settler colonialism, of military occupation is just not sustainable. And the Israeli government must be stopped before the entire Palestinian population is wiped out.
Thank you so much, Mohammed Al-Kurd, a writer and poet from Jerusalem in occupied Palestine, who's organizing to save his family's home in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of Jerusalem. Up next, we speak with the authors of a new book that alleges the nation's top general, Mark Milley, feared Donald Trump would wage a coup after losing the November election. We'll be back in a minute.
Me dicen que el 3 de noviembre la radio una noticia dio. Me dicen que el 3 de noviembre la radio una noticia dio. Y así lo gritaba la gente, un merenguero bueno se murió. Y así lo gritaba la gente, un merenguero bueno se murió. Y San Pedro conmigo fue indiferente. Y llegando a la puerta me rechazó. Él me dijo, parece usted mala gente. Déjeme consultar eso con Dios. Me quedé esperando la respuesta. Me sentía bastante preocupado. Y me dijo, aquí Dios no lo acepta. Porque usted ha cometido mucho pecado. Me mandaron derecho donde el diablo. Y tampoco me quiso abrir la puerta. Mire qué lío este. Y cuando iba saliendo me dijo un diablito. Dice el diablo que vaya para la tierra.
The Dream by the legendary Dominican merengue musician Johnny Ventura. He died last week at the age of 81. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Nermeen Sheikh with Juan Gonzalez. We end today's show with the authors of a new book that debuted last week at #1 on the bestseller list, I Alone Can Fix It, Donald J. Trump's Catastrophic Final Year. The book is by two Washington Post reporters, White House Bureau Chief Philip Rucker and Carol Leonnig, a longtime investigative reporter. Their book sheds new light on what happened during the early days of the pandemic, how Trump responded to the deadly January 6th insurrection, and alleges the nation's top general, Mark Milley, feared Trump would wage a coup after losing the November election. Rucker and Leonnig are both Pulitzer Prize winners and also co-authors of the 2020 bestseller, A Very Stable Genius, Donald J. Trump's Testing of America. Welcome to Democracy Now! Carol, let's begin with you. This is your second book on Trump. You both reported extensively on his administration. Talk about what you found in this book. What was most striking?
Yes, there were a lot of things that made our jaws drop to the ground, but I think that the most striking was just the degree to which people who wanted to serve Donald Trump, people who were ardent supporters in his White House, in his cabinet, in his administration, how much they were nearly in panic about the impulses of the president, the degree to which he was willing to put American lives in peril, and actually how much he was willing to risk the democracy, again, all for his short-term political gain, his own personal profit.
And Phil, you write that Trump told you it was his greatest regret that he did not deploy the military to shut down last year's protests over the police killings of George Floyd, saying, quote, I think if I had to do it again, I would have brought in the military immediately. You talk about that.
That's right. When Carol and I sat down with President Trump, former President Trump, earlier this spring for an interview, an extensive interview for this book, he said his only regret from that final year as president was how he handled the Black Lives Matter protests, and that he wished he had followed his impulse, his gut, to send in the military immediately into Portland and Seattle and Minneapolis, D.C., all these cities where demonstrations were taking place. He wanted to use active duty troops on the streets of America's cities to combat American protesters who were exercising their First Amendment rights. It was pretty chilling for us to hear him say that. And the book details a lot of reporting scenes that happened behind closed doors where the defense secretary and attorney general and the aforementioned chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff were trying to persuade Trump not to send in the military and explaining how that would be so inappropriate and not justified. But Trump said after the fact that he regretted not doing so.
And you also report, I guess, perhaps the most shocking revelation is how the top generals in the U.S. military were responding to Trump. You say that Joint Chiefs of Staff General Mark Milley was so afraid that Trump would attempt a coup that he and other top officials discussed a plan to resign one by one rather than carry out orders from Trump that they considered to be illegal. Could you elaborate on that further?
You know, this was a very frightening moment for us to learn as well. Remember, we were covering this administration in real time. So we thought we did a pretty good job at the first draft of history for the Washington Post. And then when we excavated this time, we found out there was a lot more fear within the Pentagon. And at the highest levels, these were people who had been to combat multiple times, and yet they were quite worried about what Donald Trump might do. As Chairman Milley told confidants and colleagues, he became convinced that President Trump was trying to get his hands on the so-called guys with the guns, the agencies like the FBI, the CIA, and the Defense Department. And the military leaders that he worked with, the other Joint Chiefs, and he began meeting to talk about how would they block the president from something that was illegal or dangerous for the country, some sort of deployment of the military that they thought was wholly inappropriate. And their plan or their plot, their counterplot, was to essentially decide that they would resign one by one, a serial reverse Saturday night massacre, if you will. The idea being that each one of them had a legal duty to give the president their best military advice. And if he were to order something, each one of them would request a meeting whereby they could give him their advice and then resign. It's almost like in slow motion. Again, they were throwing their bodies in front of something dangerous. That was their plan.
Well, Carol, I'd like to go to another facet of the last year of Trump's administration that you cover extensively in the book, beginning with this clip from your 2-hour interview with former President Trump, in which he refers to the, quote, loving crowd during the deadly January 6th insurrection.
I would venture to say, I think it was the largest crowd I've ever spoken before. It went from that point, which is almost at the White House, to beyond the Washington Monument. It was, and wide. And
but if you could have waited,
and it was a loving crowd too, by the way. There was a lot of love. I've heard that from everybody. Many people have told me that was a loving crowd.
When Capitol Police officers testified last week at the first hearing of a House committee investigating the deadly January 6th riots, Capitol Police Sergeant Aquino Gonell responded to Trump's comment.
If that was Hudson Kissinger, we should all go to his house and do the same thing to him. To me, it's insulting, it's demoralizing, because everything that we did was to prevent everyone in the Capitol from getting hurt. And what he was doing, instead of sending the military, instead of sending the support or telling his people, his supporter, to stop this nonsense, he egged them to continue fighting.
And meanwhile, as we reported earlier in headlines, a fourth Washington, D.C. area police officer who responded to the violent January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol has now died by suicide. So, Carol, could you respond to this latest news and also what Trump said in his interview with you on the so-called loving crowd?
You know, there couldn't be a more stark split screen between Officer Gonell, Metropolitan Police Officer Fanone, what they actually experienced, what they told the public that medieval combat was like, as they tried to protect the lawmakers and the staffers on the Hill who were scrambling for their lives from Donald Trump's supporters, from chance of execution for Vice President Pence. That's on one side of the screen. And on the other side of the screen is Donald Trump sitting down with Phil and with me in Mar-a-Lago and explaining that this was a loving crowd, that he was watching them on television, and he felt very supported by them, glad that they were going to stop the steal, that they were going to show their support for the fact that he believed the election was rigged, though there's no evidence for it, and they were going to help him stay in power. I thought that Officer Gonell's remarks about the fact that he's still trying to recover from those hugs and kisses that Donald Trump told us the protesters were giving was really on the mark. There were no Capitol Police officers warmly ushering in these individuals, as President Trump, former President Trump, told Phil and me when we were visiting with him. There was no love. There was a threat of death. There were chants for hanging Mike Pence. There were officers who were screaming for their lives, and as Officer Fanone described, literally having a heart attack, having the wherewithal to call out to the people around him, please don't take my gun, please don't hurt me, I have children. Donald Trump was in a room watching television while that was happening.
And Phil Rucker, you, the first section of your book deals with the President Trump's response to the biggest crisis of his presidency, clearly the COVID pandemic. And he told you that I think we did a great job on COVID and it hasn't been recognized. Could you talk about his paranoia on believing that the drug manufacturers actually tried to delay the COVID vaccine in order to hurt his election chances?
Sure. You know, Trump seemed to think that all of his enemies, his perceived enemies, were out to get him during the COVID pandemic, in part because he saw the pandemic through the prism of his reelection chances. He thought he was on a glide path to winning a second term before COVID arrived, and that COVID spoiled his chances of winning the election last November. He had particular disdain for pharmaceutical companies, for drug makers, in part because of some tensions earlier in the administration between the industry and his administration. But during COVID, he thought that they were slow walking the development of a vaccine. He thought it was imperative that he have a vaccine or multiple vaccines developed, tested, and ready to be distributed before Election Day so that he could get political credit for that. And when that did not become a possibility, he became enraged. And he was especially angry at Pfizer because Pfizer made their announcement about a week or so after the election that their first COVID vaccine had met the mark. And Trump thought that was intentionally delayed to hurt him politically. There, of course, is no evidence to support that claim, but it does show you a little bit the paranoia in Trump's mind that he thought individuals, but also companies, industries were plotting to try to undermine his political standing.
And Carol, I wanted to ask you about this. Trump's conviction or clear belief that he was going to win on election night and his reaction as the numbers came in that night and the days that followed. Also, if you could talk about the role of Rudy Giuliani. I mean, I covered Rudy Giuliani throughout his period when he was mayor of New York, and I always believed back then that there was something not right about him, but most people then didn't agree. Talk about the relationship between Giuliani and Trump, if you can, as well.
Of course. You know, the conviction issue that you mentioned is so interesting because what Phil and I learned was that in the days before the election, President Trump had been warned multiple times that this was going to be a hard slog and that the odds were not great. You know, people who were paid to tell him that the odds were great were warning him that it didn't look so good, that Biden's poll numbers were quite strong. And in fact, we learned that unbeknownst to us when we were reporting in real time, that Bill Barr called the defense secretary the night before the election to say that he had learned from White House sources that the president, whether he won or not, was planning to declare that night, election night, that he had won before all the ballots were counted, that was sort of a plan that was being cooked up. And it's unclear where Bill Barr heard this, but it was from inside the White House. So the conviction that President Trump had that he was going to win or had won really started to solidify after he lost. His conviction that it had been stolen from him was what got more calcified as time went on. The reason is he basically shut out those people, those adults who were explaining to him that he had lost, people he had trusted and had as confidants alongside him for years, people like Hope Hicks, who, counseled him that he was ruining his legacy, that he needed to think about, graciously and appropriately conceding. People like Kellyanne Conway, who said she really didn't see the evidence and asked the president to either produce it or think about a plan B for stepping away. And what's interesting about Rudy is he represents the group of individuals on that fringe who were spinning increasingly fanatical tales of how this election was stolen. Though Bill Barr had a team of Department of Justice prosecutors and also FBI agents ultimately underneath him investigating these claims, he warned the president they'd looked into all of them. They were nonsense. They were BS. But Rudy kept insisting they were true. On election night, he was the voice who said, just declare victory, just say you won, even as important swing states were coming down for Biden and looked like they were going to go for Biden pretty strongly. So Rudy was warned, actually, and this is sort of the most colossal fall from grace that I think I've seen in covering politicians and government officials. This was America's mayor. This was one of the strongest, most revered federal prosecutors in the country. Chris Christie, governor of New Jersey, former, warned Rudy in a phone call after the election that he was ruining his legacy and that he was becoming a joke on late night television. And Rudy hollered back at him and said, I'm fighting for now. Who cares about legacy? I'm fighting for today. But everything he was fighting for was a mirage.
Well, speaking of today, let's talk about what prospects Trump has in a possible future campaign. New federal campaign finance filings show that Trump has raised more funds than other Republicans in online donations during the first half of this year, entering July with more than $100 million from his 2021 political committees. Some say Trump is pursuing a, quote, shadow presidency as he plans to run again in 2024. On Friday, Mark Meadows, former chief of staff for the Trump White House, told Newsmax Trump is now meeting with people he called cabinet members at his golf resort in New Jersey.
We met with some of our cabinet members tonight. We actually had a follow-up member meeting with some of our cabinet members, and as we were looking at that, we're looking at what does come next. I'm not authorized to speak on behalf of the president, okay. But I can tell you this, Steve. We wouldn't be meeting tonight if we weren't making plans to move forward in a real way and with President Trump at the head of that ticket.
Philip Rucker, your response, and on the question in particular on continuing Republican support for Trump.
Yeah, well, look, the Republican support continues to be very strong for Donald Trump. He's by far the most popular figure in Republican politics today. He has made no secret about his desire to run for president again in 2024. And when Carol and I sat down with him, it was clear to us that he wanted back in the game, that he sort of had that itch to get into the arena again. He has a lot of time left before he has to make that decision about whether to actually launch a campaign for 2024, but all signs point towards the likely possibility that he does. And if he were to run, barring some change in the political environment, he would almost certainly become the Republican presidential nominee. He is that popular in his party right now.
Thank you so much, Philip Rucker, Carol Leonnig, co-authors of I Alone Can Fix It, Donald J. Trump's Catastrophic Final Year. And that does it for the show. I'm Nermeen Sheikh with Juan Gonzalez. Stay safe.